Thank you both. Just before, we're a little bit behind on time, but just before we go to a tea break, we have one more speaker. I'd like to present Hassen Bali from Ion Ventures. Ion Ventures is a, I guess, financing fund, but sorry, a project financier, and we'll talk about how dispatchable renewable energy systems can displace diesel generation and improve reliability at the grid edge. Hassan, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for hosting, and very much appreciate the invitation from the Alliance for Rural Electrification and from SEAS. I think, obviously, conscious of the fact that we're all very keen to have our tea and coffee break. I'll probably skip through a few bits because the slides will be shared afterwards. But I think the first thing to look at is our role as an energy transition specialist. Our experience is really from having operated in the UK and European markets, where there's a level of, let's call it, sophistication around energy storage, which we see as a kind of a axiomatic addition to any renewable energy penetration. And as a result of that, and the fact that certain markets have been very innovative in the deployment of that technology at scale, how it applies in the ASEAN region, particularly in conjunction with renewables, and can support some of the challenges that have been specifically identified. I think for us, we really look at the fact that there's a very clear direction of travel at a global level. I think everyone in this room knows there's a huge need. There's a general commitment towards energy transition, but we now need to start seeing deployment at a much greater scale. And I think the most compelling number for me is on the far right of this slide, which is when you actually look at the amount of capital that needs to be dedicated to emerging markets and developing countries for energy transition, it's $1 trillion a year, from 2030. And I think at the last estimates I saw, we're probably 28 times behind, sadly, on that figure. And part of that is obviously about how do we as a collective come up with solutions that are compelling, that are proven. But I also think there's a very big ask of the financing sector to sort of close that gap from their side as well. And so for us, whilst we do look at financing and cornerstoning these projects, we tend to syndicate capital in with our partners. But we also look at the development life cycle as well, and how to bring through very high quality, what I would call institutional investment grade assets. Because I think that whilst there is a huge amount of activity in developing projects, that gap between what your project is and does, and how you articulate that to the investment community, is often the hardest part of the process. There are on the ground challenges, but anyone who develops is a problem solver. Anyone who innovates is a problem solver. And so the ability to come up with solutions that work, I think, is just in that DNA within the community of companies doing that. The challenge is how do you then move that to the point where it's demonstrably bankable and you're actually going to be able to move finance and at scale. So for us, we've been looking for a number of years at how do we bring our experience from other markets to bear here, and how do we look at identifying opportunities that can blend technologies, blend development experience, and how to look at bankability and to provide assets that will be able to capture that capital and roll it out into projects. And I think that there's a more detailed example I'll move to in a minute, but the sort of the piece that people have talked about, which is the grid network, and obviously whether you're at the edge of the grid or you're completely off grid, often the question is how do you make best use of your resource, and particularly here solar, and how do you shape that to demand or to that sort of edge of the grid where you're the first to be curtailed if you don't meet whatever it is that the network is looking for. And in its simplest fashion, there's a very clear need for hybridizing power, but looking at how you size your best to shape that. And so, in terms of technical innovation, this is something which people have been doing for a long time. We are, one of many that can do this, but I think the value add is how do you then demonstrate that you have the development rigor, all of the constituent pieces, and then the ability to elevate that into something that commercially works with a counterparty that will pay in a way that underwrites an investment. Um, and I think we see lots of technical scenarios that people don't necessarily factor in with their design. And that's how you end up with power that can be shaped through seasonality, through different weather conditions. And certainly now, as the technology that's available, and we're agnostic, so we tend to use, the most commercially um, compelling, both in terms of technical and price. And obviously, the supply chain world has done a huge job for us in reducing capex. It's then also getting your sizing right, getting your technical analysis right, and understanding your specific location to design a system that will not just work for some of the year, but will work through the year. And there are different periods of time depending on where you are. So we've just looked at sort of, three key scenarios where you'll have obviously the especially sunny days, which are the really straightforward ones because you have a huge glut of power, and then it's quite easy to shift that later. But if you design your system right, you can start to take advantage of more cloudy or even more stormy days. And I think for us, that's one of the things that needs to be factored into the design, because there are certain parts of the world where you have a huge number, 200 plus days of sunshine per annum. They're quite straightforward to design for. This part of the world is very different. The weather changes, the seasonality is very different, and you have to factor that in from the start. So these are the sorts of things that we would look at. More locally within the region, the Philippines, people talk about. I think the thing that we see is that there is already a high penetration of electrification, but quality, price, and reliability is very, very disparate, or there's a huge spectrum around that. And what we've seen particularly is you start to look at the islanded areas, which tend to be catered for under their own, let's call it, regulatory or grid operator body, because they're all separate cooperatives. Is there such a huge spread? Tradition of thermal IPPs with a level of delivered power, pretty aging fleet of mostly diesel gensets, a few small scale coal, and the like. And as a result, some of those are grid, sort of semi-grid opportunities. Some of them are fully standalone. And what we see is that if you're someone like, the DOE and Napocor in the Philippines, you're subsidizing on the pass-through of fuel a huge amount per annum. Your actual delivered cost of power is in the high double-digit pesos. Yet your consumer, whilst being charged a number that for them is still expensive, whether it's in the high single or the low double-digit per number of pesos per kilowatt hour, you as DOE or Napocor are subsidizing a massive amount. I think at the last numbers we saw, it's over $200 million per annum subsidizing diesel across those systems, which is an unsustainable way to go. So our view is, how do you come up with solutions that can cater for all facets of that problem, because there's such a clear commercial opportunity in displacing that diesel, in reducing that subsidy, which is beneficial at a kind of almost a national economic level, and with that catering for the on the ground problems, not just of energy delivery but of energy quality. And certainly, I think that's not really something that has been looked at in detail by the incumbents. And that's something that the combination of solar and batteries can definitely solve. And how we look at it, whilst we think that the combination of solar BESS is probably the most compelling system to go for, there is actually already small-scale standalone BESS opportunities, given some of the quality issues from frequency and voltage management, that has a very deeply negative impact on the experience that consumers and users of electrical infrastructure or industrial manufacturing equipment experience as a result of that. I'll move to something which is a little bit bigger in scale, but for me, even though the scale is larger, the problem is the same as the ones that we're talking about, whether it's islanded or even in a country like Bangladesh, because the rate of demand growth, the desire to include renewables over time, has led to a significant challenge in meeting that demand, and a real reliance on high carbon energy, and relatively poor quality and poor service. It's a country where, depending on which part you're in, you might have 3 to 4 hours of curtailment as a user every day. in certain parts of the country, particularly in the north, which is the slightly higher ground area. The combination of poor transmission infrastructure, very long lead times for transmission reinforcement, relatively poor distribution infrastructure because of very long lines that are overloaded and aging, and a generation mix that is incredibly inflexible and expensive. What we've identified are lots of ways of using decentralized renewables or co-located technologies to alleviate some of those pressures from all three of those dimensions. And again, without going to super low detail here, if you've got a fleet which is really thermal based, that gives you obviously not much of a hope of achieving your decarbonisation objectives, which countries like Bangladesh have signed up for. When you look at the transmission, both in terms of the time it's going to take for some of these areas to have transmission reinforcements, which is 10 years plus, the cost of doing so, it's really a convergence of factors that are deeply unhelpful if you're on the ground trying to receive high quality power to maintain either your quality of life or your industrial and commercial activities. And those distribution challenges, I think, are analogous to what most people in the room will see, within the region, depending on which part of the region or which countries and specific locations you look at. But that challenge, our view is, can be dealt with in a more ground-up approach, which comes to this role of these technology solutions. We're working through with Bangladesh at the moment for this particular project. We've had a few ripples, a bit around government and changes in government, which has stalled us a bit. But as an example, this project is what we ended up proposing to government, which was a co-located. It's 250 megawatts of solar, 160 megawatt hours of battery. We went top down. We were lucky to have done an engagement with the EU to look at the energy roadmap in Bangladesh, how that would enable the role of storage and flexibility into the system. We identified a region within Bangladesh that was deeply underserved in terms of quality and availability, rolling blackouts and significant economic disruption, probably to the tune of 80 to 90 million US dollars per annum of missed economic opportunity. And so this system, having gone through work with the Power Distribution Board, Department of Energy, and gone through all of the design simulations, was something that they were moving forward with under the previous government, and we're now looking at how we get that through with the new government. The nice thing about this from a bankability point of view is, the mobilization of interest and involvement from groups like the IFC, etc. Now, it's a bit easier to attract that kind of activity when you're talking about such a large project. And I think the challenge that we see is, how do you bring that down into smaller projects, whether through aggregation? But the key thing is the standardization of approach. There is a methodology here by which you can show consistently that you can produce really high quality, compelling opportunities, because the conditions that exist at this scale exist at the small scale as well. And so whether that's on a case by case or on an aggregated basis, we see huge opportunity to articulate this in a way that becomes more, let's say, appetizing or straightforward from a risk management perspective for investors to sign off on. Because when you break it down, both in terms of carbon reduction, in terms of energy savings from subsidizing fossil fuels, every single metric, it should be an absolute positive for going for the renewable energy based solution. And finally, just in terms of system operation and the economic dispatch, there's lots of ways of demonstrating the actual value for this. If you're either, the local government that is subsidizing fuel, the local system operator that is dealing with the challenges of meeting demand and dealing with a sort of aging and inefficient fleet. And so our view is that, the extent to which the technology landscape, the development landscape has evolved and innovated hugely, especially over the last decade. Our view is that the process by which these opportunities are articulated and the way in which the finance world now starts to engage is the real area of innovation that we would like to see pushing forward. Because I think, the cost is there, the proposition is there, the technology is there, how do we make sure that we convince the financing world that they're ready, it's time to step up and help us to deliver all of this. So thanks for the opportunity, and enjoy coffee.